Hey everyone, welcome to Introduction to Cognitive Science. I'm Adam, and the focus of our lecture today is on syntax and syntactic tree diagrams. So today, let's have fun drawing syntactic tree diagrams for sentences. The value of this is at least twofold. It'll help us appreciate the hierarchical structure of sentences. It'll also help us appreciate discussions about rules and rule following more generally in linguistics, philosophy, and cognitive science. So I've provided you with a variety of different types of sentences so we can practice drawing tree diagrams for different sentence types. At your own pace, practice working through these examples with me on paper or on your computer. Over here on the right side, you see that I've provided some different sample sentences drawing upon a general Batman theme. Okay, and the purpose of these different sentence types is by practicing different sentences. Some of them have adverbs, some of them have adjectives, some of them have recursion under the NP, some of them have recursion under the VP. We'll get better insight into the systematic and productive nature of human cognition. Okay, although we could spend a whole semester focusing on syntax, investigating the rules, all the syntax, the phrase structure rules, also assessing, right? We can ask more fine-grained questions such as, what is a noun, right? What is a verb? We often think of nouns as person, places, or things, but nouns also include abstract ideas, right? So we can really get into it and ask questions about what nouns are, what verbs are. We can ask questions like, how do we treat degree words? Are they adverbs or are they slightly unique, right? And there's many interesting questions of this. How do we treat conjunctions and that clauses? Many fascinating questions, right? But rather than focusing on those specific questions in syntax, which would be more suitable for a course on syntax, our focus for today is to work through these sentences and use these sample sentences to help us gain insight on the systematic and productive nature of human cognition. Okay, so we're going to use syntax as a vehicle to understand cognition more generally today. Okay, recall that in the last previous lectures, when we were talking about spoken language acquisition and sign language acquisition, we saw that oftentimes children are in environments in which their linguistic input is impoverished, right? So we've seen that children, they have this ability to impose systematicity onto that impoverished linguistic input, right? So there's something like rules or universal grammar, something like that in their mind, right? That helps to systematize that impoverished linguistic input. And so we often make use of this notion of rules and principles in linguistics and cognitive science. Okay, and one of the main things I want you to get a hold on today or get a grasp on today is how we apply rules in a systematic and productive way to account for grammatical structure. Okay, it's not so important that we memorize the specific list of rules that I've provided for you. Okay, the list of rules that I provided for you serve mostly a pedagogical purpose. I don't want to suggest that these rules are UG, right? Like this is what UG consists of. Okay, there's some really interesting debates within linguistics on which, like, should all these rules be included as acceptable rules, or should we only accept a subset of these rules, right? Maybe there's a rule that's missing. Maybe there's more rules that we need to include. Maybe there's a more abstract way to characterize these rules so we can have a more economic list, right? And you see that there's often trade-offs in theory, right, between sort of having the capacity to be very explicit about many different example types, right? So I might have a system in which no matter what sentence you give me, I can be super explicit and provide step-by-step tree diagrams for any sentence you give me. But to do that, I might require more rules to have that explanatory power, right? On the other hand, if I value economy, like Occam's razor, if what I want is a economical theoretical framework, then what I may have to, the trade-off on that is I may not be able to be as explicit, right? And we'll see in the examples today. I actually provide you an example of this sort of trade-off in that in one area where I want to be very explicit, right, I use an extra step, right? But that step can be removed, right? Providing a more economical diagram, but it assumes just a little bit more knowledge. Okay, so for the introductory course, I just want to be very explicit and show the steps. But right, as you feel comfortable with the material, I encourage you to explore, use Google Scholar, search for more focused research in this area, and you'll see that there's some really interesting debates between different systems, different ways to account for different linguistic phenomena. Okay. So this is not the last lecture on syntax, but the first, okay? Finally, another point that I want to make here, well, a few points that I want to make here is that remember that a sentence is not just a string of words, right? But rather a sentence is a structural arrangement, right? So a sentence has a hierarchical organizational structure and not just a linear order, okay? And the reason why I emphasize that at the outset is so that way we are very clear in that what forms a sentence are going to be phrases, like noun phrases and verb phrases, because these represent structural components and not just words, okay? So how not to draw a tree diagram is like noun, verb, and that's a sentence, right? Because a sentence is not just words, right? But rather noun phrase, verb phrase, right? And the beauty and power of the phrase part, right, is that is what's allows for replacements, substitutions, right? So a noun phrase, for example, could be Batman, but another noun phrase is Bruce Wayne, right? Or the King of France, right? All those different varieties, all those different word sequences, they are noun phrases, right? And what we can do to make sure that we've drawn our trees correctly is we can practice substituting one for another. And our tree diagram or the sentence should still be intelligible, although the tree diagram may require a little bit more work, right? So the King of France is bald and Joe is bald, right? I can replace the King of France with Joe because they're both noun phrases at the noun phrase level, okay? And so we see that's why we want to use the NP and not just an N, because the NP will allow us to substitute structures, right? Things that are also NPs, okay? So you see that we have systematicity at both the sort of the lexical item level, like what kind of word is Batman? Is that a verb or a noun, right? But also at the phrase level, is this a noun phrase or a verb phrase? Okay, so cool. All right, now we're gonna start with our first sample sentence, which is Catwoman escaped, right? So you should have a question at this point, is how do we proceed? How do we begin to provide a tree diagram for this sample sentence, okay? So the first thing I want you to do is think about the sentence, the linguistic items that are included in the sentence, right? And we see that there's Catwoman and escaped, right? So now what we need to do is identify each of those items, what kind of items they are, right? Catwoman is a noun, escaped is a verb. So if we want to draw a tree for that, right, we're going to have to make Catwoman not just a noun, but an NP, noun phrase, and then escape, not just the verb, but that will also be the verb phrase. And then boom, right, now we have the NP and the VP, and that can form the sentence, right? And we see that we have the rules for that on the right, and we can sort of use the rules to justify the moves that we make in our tree diagram, right? Just like we would use the rules of chess to justify the moves that we make when we play chess. Okay. All right, so after we've identified our linguistic items, then we want to look at the rules that are provided for us and build the tree structure in accord with these rules. Okay. The phrase structure rules guide you on how to build legal or well-formed sentences. Okay. All right, so I've sort of given you a hint or the solution for this one already, but this will be the structure of the lecture for today. Is I'm going to give you a sample sentence like Catwoman escaped. I'll give you a moment to reflect on this example and provide the category labels for each linguistic item, and then go ahead and try to draw on your scratch paper or on your computer. Try your best to provide a structure for this. And then once you've given this a good shot or honest attempt, move on to the next slide and you'll see the solution for you. Okay. And here I just put this picture of a skeleton, the human skeletal system, because I think it's useful to think about tree diagrams in that way, right? Just like the human skeletal system provides a general structure, right, in which we can understand different humans, tree diagrams are similar in that they provide us a structure in which we can understand different types of sentences, right? And some skeletons look like are in the form of humans and others are in the form of dogs, right? And similarly, we have different linguistic structures that take different forms, okay? All right, so go ahead and draw the tree diagram for Catwoman escaped. I already told you how to do it, so you shouldn't need too long to solve this. Let's move on. And here is our solution, okay? So the way that you can start this is on the right over here, you see that we have the tree. Starting at the bottom, right? You can start at the bottom of your page, you can write Catwoman and then escaped. Ask yourself, what kind of linguistic item is Catwoman? And you can draw a little line and then write, it's a noun. So you can write N, okay? Over by escape, you can draw a line. What kind of linguistic item is that? It's a verb, so you can draw a V, right? But remember, sentences do not consist of nouns and verbs, but of noun phrases and verb phrases. So we can't stop at just the N and the V. We're gonna draw another line up and connect the N to an NP, right? And draw another line up from the V and connect that to a VP, okay? Because Catwoman is not just the noun in this sentence, but it's also the noun phrase in this sentence. And escaped is not just the verb in this sentence, it's also the verb phrase in this sentence, right? And now we can combine the noun phrase and the verb phrase to form the sentence, okay? The reason, again, just to be super clear here, we want this to be an NP is because I might substitute Catwoman with another NP. And we see over here, NP allows me to do different things, right? Like this could be the Joker escaped instead of Catwoman escaped, right? Because an NP can take a determiner and a noun as we see right here, okay? So that's sort of the beauty of having these category labels at the phrase and item level. All right, let's go ahead and move on to our next example. This example is the Joker laughed. First thing we want to do, identify these lexical items, right? What kind of word is the? What kind of word is Joker? What kind of word or item is laughed? Okay. If you forget, right, you can always look it up in the dictionary. And by each word, it'll provide you with what sort of part of speech or what category it is, right? Just be careful because for some items, there may be more than one possible category that it can belong to, okay? Well, I'll just tell you right now, it's a determiner, and there's different types of determiners, right? There's the picks out something uniquely, like the King of France picks out one unique King of France, where right, like a dog picks out one out of multiple or possibly many instances. Okay, so I bought a dog, just means that I got one of potentially many dogs. But if I got the dog, I seem to be suggesting like there's only one such dog. Okay. All right, and then Joker laughed. You should be able to provide labels for those. And let's go ahead and move on now. Okay, try to draw the tree diagram for this. And let's go ahead and move on. So the is the determiner, right? So under the, we can write DET, an abbreviation for determiner, okay? Joker is an N, so we can write N on top of that. Laughed is a V, so we can write a verb, so we can write a V on top of that, okay? Now we can go ahead and use our rules to put the parts together. Okay, so an NP consists of a determiner and a noun, or a determiner and a noun phrase. Okay, here I left this in NP because we'll see in a subsequent example in a few slides down that by having an NP, we could be productive underneath this NP. Okay, if I just although for this particular example, it's perfectly suitable to just have to connect the N right there, right? So this is sort of like what I meant in the beginning of the lecture. This is sort of an optional step that I included just to be very explicit in the lecture today, right? I might the snow and winter, right? In Gotham, right? If I'm gonna be using those extra prepositional phrases, right, I'm going to need more structure underneath this NP. So then if in that case, I couldn't just have the N there, I would need to allow for more structure. So in this example, I just wanted this to be an NP to show that I could ditch it later, right? I can like pull it out and throw it away and put something else underneath there that's more complex, right? And that allows for more productivity underneath the NP. Okay, so again, we will always want to think about trade-offs between explicitness, like, hey, look what I can do here, versus economy. Okay. All right. So, and just so that way we know that we haven't violated any rules, we can just check our rules, right? S takes an NP and a VP. We see that both in the tree diagram and the rule here. We can check in our phrase structure rules that that's a legitimate rule, right? So S takes NP and VP. Great. Next is NP takes a determiner and a noun, right? So a noun phrase is not just something like Catwoman, right? But also it can be something like the Joker, okay? And so to draw that, we have a determiner and a noun, right? And it's the Joker, okay? And then our VP takes a V and V is laughed, okay? All right, let's keep it going. Our next example is the Joker laughed hysterically. So take a moment to identify each of these lexical items. The Joker laughed and hysterically. Okay, we've already identified the Joker and laughed. So now you have to ask yourself, what's going on with hysterically, right? Is that an adverb or an adjective? Now, can you remember from when you studied English grammar, what kind of item that is, right? And if you have a hard time remembering, just remember it's a sort of baked into the word, right? An adverb is going to modify or qualify a verb, and an adjective is going to modify or qualify the noun, okay? So using that, let's move on to the solution here. So we know that the is a determiner, Joker is a noun, and laughed is a verb. We saw that from the last example. The thing that I wanted to add here for this example was hysterically, right? And we see that that is an adverb, right? It qualifies or modifies the verb, right? It goes with laughed, okay? Like what kind of laugh? A hysterical laugh, right? So we provide a label for each of these, okay? Now, in order to provide the tree structure, the new thing that's going on here is we see up here, the VP was just laughed, right? So the VP just took a V and the V took laughed. Here, we're just showing you that the VP doesn't have to just take a V. It can also take something different. So we can throw that out. And now we have a VP taking a V and an adverb phrase, okay? And we see that that rule is provided here. Under VP, it takes a V and an adverb phrase, right? So right here, we see that that's allowed, okay? Great. And then we know we have a rule that says that an adverb phrase can take an adverb, okay? And that's provided right here, okay? So excellent. We know that all the moves that we want to make to provide this tree diagram are allowed and legal, okay? And that gives us the tree structure for the sentence. The Joker laughed hysterically. Next sentence, Catwoman is very quiet. Let's go ahead and identify each of the lexical items, okay? Or each of these linguistic items, okay? Catwoman, what is that? Is very and quiet. Take one moment and let's move on. Okay, so we know that Catwoman is a noun, is a verb, very is a degree word, and quiet is an adjective, okay? Who's quiet? Catwoman is quiet, right? So we know that it's the noun, right? That's being modified or qualified here with quiet, okay? All right. This is the rules that allow or license each of these moves, okay? We see that the sentence takes an NP and a VP, a noun phrase and a verb phrase. The noun phrase takes the noun, which is Catwoman. The verb phrase takes a verb and an adjective phrase, okay? And we see that the rule for that is right here. The VP takes a V and an adjective phrase, okay, great. And the verb in this case is, okay? And then the adjective phrase takes a degree word and an adjective. And we see that that rule is provided right here. An adjective phrase takes a degree word and an adjective, okay? The degree word in this case is very, and the adjective is quiet, okay? And boom, now we have the tree structure for Catwoman is very quiet. And now that we've acquired this skeletal structure, we can understand and cognize other similar structures, right? Batman is very loud, or what have you, right? Dogs are very loud, or whatnot. You see that even just by following the same types, we can generate lots of unique thoughts, which is really awesome. The next sentence, Batman is always prepared. Okay, so take a moment, go ahead and identify each of those items, those linguistic items, okay? And I'm not gonna pause too much in between. I'm running tight on battery life, so just pause the video if you need to work through the exercise, and then unpause and join me so we can keep it going, okay? Ready? And let's move on to the solution. All right, so Batman is a noun, so we write an N on top of it. Is a verb, so we write a V on top of that, right? Always is an adverb, so we write ADV on top of that. And prepared is an adjective, okay? So we write ADJ on top of that, okay? Now we need to put these things together, okay? Always prepared is the adjective phrase, right? So we label the head here, adjective phrase, okay? Is always prepared is the verb phrase. So this is labeled VP, okay? Batman is always prepared is the sentence, okay? And just to be clear, that's how you read these structures, right? Very quiet, adjective phrase. Is very quiet is the verb phrase. Catwoman is very quiet is the sentence, okay? For this example 3, laughed hysterically is the verb phrase, right? The Joker is the noun phrase. The Joker laughed hysterically is the sentence, okay? And then the Joker is the noun phrase. Laughed is the verb phrase. The Joker laughed is the sentence. And then Catwoman is the noun phrase and escaped is a verb phrase. And Catwoman escaped is the sentence, okay? So the point I'm just trying to say here is, as we get more complicated structures, you might start losing track of like, what kind of structure do we have hanging out down here, right? And I just want to remind you that, right, when the label right here, adjective phrase, is classifying this, that it holds together, okay? So if I'm ADJP, right, the adjective phrase, I'm holding on to adjective phrase, what is an adjective phrase right there, okay? And it's just important to know that so that way you can substitute like for like elements, okay? So Batman is always prepared. This is how we diagram that sentence, okay? And the rules are provided for you right here, okay? And for all my students in the course, go ahead and look in the file section. I've provided the slides for you so you can take your time and work through these as slowly as you like. All right, this next example, Bruce Wayne is intelligent. The sort of the novel thing with this example is, how do we treat this over here? Bruce Wayne, right? We haven't dealt with that just yet. So we'll figure out how to deal with that in this example, okay? So ask yourself, what is Bruce? What is Wayne? What is, and what is intelligent? What kind of linguistic items are those? Let's provide some categorical labels for that. Okay, ready? Let's move on to the solution. So Bruce is a noun, but so is Wayne. All right, so those are both nouns. Okay, and there's a rule that allows us to combine two nouns to form a noun phrase. Okay, and that rule is right here. An NP can take an N and an N. Okay, so that's what we use over here. An NP can take an N and an N. The N and the N in this case is the Bruce and the Wayne. Okay, so boom, that's our noun phrase in this case. Okay, and just remember that we could have switched this NP for any of the other NPs at the NP level, right? It could have been Catwoman is intelligent, or the Joker is intelligent, or whatnot, right? And at the NP level, it's perfectly substitutable. Okay. All right, and then over here under the VP, we know that the VP takes a V and an adjective phrase. The V in this case is, the adjective phrase in this case is the adjective intelligent. Okay, so Bruce Wayne is intelligent. The next sentence, and these are kind of fun because we're going to see some recursion or embedding underneath the NP. Okay, the first one though is just this sentence, snow falls in winter. Okay. So ask yourself, what kind of linguistic items for snow, falls in, and winter? Ask yourself what kind of linguistic items those are. Okay, and I'm going to move on to the next slide. Ready? And here we go. Okay. So the fun thing about this example is that we have a preposition and we get to work with a prepositional phrase, right? We've been working with NPs and VPs, adjective phrases, and I think we did adverb phrase too. Now we get to work with the prepositional phrase. Okay, so we're just expanding our phrasal types. Okay. So the cool thing about prepositional phrases is it's one of the tools, linguistic tools, that allows for recursion and embedding. Okay, another one will be the conjunction for that clauses. Okay, but we'll get to that in a few more examples. Okay, here we know that snow is a noun, so we label it an N. We know that falls is a verb, so we label it a V. We know that in is a preposition, so we label it a P. We know that winter is a noun, so we label it an N. Okay. We know that in winter is a prepositional phrase, right? So that's why this is packed under the PP over here, okay? And we see that there's a rule, right? The PP can take a P and an NP, all right? Falls in winter is the verb phrase, okay? And so that's why we have falls in winter here, right? And we know that the VP can take a V and a PP. And that's provided here, right? VP can take a V and a PP, okay? And this should be embedded in your knowledge now, right? How we treat the NP, okay? Just snow. So snow falls in winter is the tree diagram for this sentence, okay? Now that we feel comfortable with this, we're going to make it a little bit more complex by using another prepositional phrase in the next example. Or not just yet, okay? Soon we'll get to it, okay? As you can tell, I get excited about the snow falls examples. I think these are really fun, okay? But this one is snow falls slowly in winter, okay? So we're not adding another preposition just yet, but we're working with the word slowly, and we'll sort of see how that changes the tree structure just a little bit, okay? So go ahead and identify these linguistic items for me. Snow falls slowly in and winter. And let's move on to the next slide. Ready? All right. So we know that it's not snow that's slowly, right? That sounds really funny, but it's fall slowly, right? It's the verb that's being modified or qualified by slowly. So we know that slowly is an adverb, okay? And that was the only sort of new item in this sentence. We know what snow falls and in and winter are, okay? So we just label those appropriately, right? Snow is a noun, falls is a verb, slowly is an adverb, in is a preposition, and winter is a noun, okay? And now that we've labeled those and we're familiar with the rules, I want to just highlight for you how we bundle these up, right? In winter, what is that, right? That's a prepositional phrase, right? So we see that the PP takes the P and the NP, NP takes an N, the N is winter and the P is in, okay? The adverb phrase is slowly in winter, okay? So that's what we have right here. And we see that the adverb phrase, it can take an adverb and a prepositional phrase, right? So that rule is right there. Falls slowly in winter is the verb phrase, right? So this whole unit is a verb phrase. We label it VP, okay? And we see that the VP can take a V and an adverb phrase, okay? And then snow falls slowly in winter is the sentence. Okay, and we see that an S can take an NP and a VP right there. Okay, so that's how we unpack each step via the phrase structure rules. Okay, all right, we're gonna start moving on to more complicated examples. So that's why the font got smaller. All right, we're gonna have to work with more prepositions and prepositional phrases in these examples, okay? But I think that's fun, and it illustrates the awesome productive nature of language, okay? So far with all the replacements, like, we can replace NP with NP, or a PP with a PP, or a adjective phrase with an adjective phrase. We can do all these like for like replacements, right? Which is demonstrated systematicity. With the PPs, right, we're going to see the recursive or productive power of language, okay? So go ahead and label these linguistic items for me. The, snow, in, winter, in, Gotham, falls slowly, right? We want to provide a tree structure for the sentence. The snow and winter in Gotham falls slowly, okay? So take a moment to label those, right? We know for the most part what these are now, right? We've actually dealt with all these before, right? In one manner or another. Like in, we know what that is. So let's move, keep it going, okay? So the is the determiner, snow is a noun, in is a preposition, winter is a noun, in is a preposition, Gotham is a noun, okay? Falls is a verb, and slowly is an adverb, okay? This is not new. We've discussed this in more detail in all the previous examples, okay? The cool thing that we're doing here with this example is, in this example, it shows you how we can reiterate this prepositional phrase underneath the noun phrase, right? And it's one of the things I think it's really awesome about the productive nature of language is sort of this little thing. So I just want to highlight this for you and show you that in principle, we could keep applying the rule, right? But it's more due to practical limitations, like that I don't have enough space on this slide, that I have a limited working memory capacity, and so on, that I can't generate in reality an infinitely long sentence. But the insight here is that in principle, right, like given the principles and rules that we have for language, there's nothing in principle that's preventing us from just boom, 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 reiterating this sort of prepositional phrase, okay, within the underneath the NP, okay. And we'll see that in future examples. I'll then focus on that clauses underneath the VP, which is also highlights the productive nature of language, okay. So we see that the S takes a NP and a VP, okay. The thing that we want to focus on for this slide is what's going on underneath the NP, okay. So we see that an NP can take a determiner and an NP, right? So we see right here, NP goes to determiner and NP, right? So remember, now we need that NP here, right? Before we were considering, do we even need that NP? Like, why not just connect it straight to an N, right? And in that very simple example, sure, that would have worked straight away. But what I was trying to show is that we can throw that out and replace it with something way more complex like this, right? So it doesn't have to be like the, but it can be the, all this complicated stuff, right? Which is really cool that we can do that, okay? So we see that now under here, we're looking at the NP. The NP takes an N and a PP. In other words, a noun phrase can take a noun and a prepositional phrase, okay? And the rule we have is here, NP can take a noun and a prepositional phrase, okay, sweet. Now, what about the prepositional phrase? Well, a prepositional phrase can take a preposition and a noun phrase, right? So we see that right here, a prepositional phrase can take a preposition and a noun phrase. So that gets us here, right? And what's cool is now that NP can take a P and a PP again, right? So we can keep applying this if we want to, which I think is really fun, okay? But just to keep this within sanity level for today, we'll just stop right here. The snow and winter in Gotham, right? And then fall slowly, okay? And remember that I pointed out earlier that this is treated as one unit, right? The snow and winter in Gotham falls slowly. We could have just said snow falls slowly, right? Because snow is also an NP. And that's what's really cool is at the NP level, we can take it, throw it away, substitute it for another NP, which snow is also an N, and then the snow is also an NP and an N, right? We could also just use snow falls slowly, okay? So we see here going phrase structure by phrase structure, we see that in Gotham is a prepositional phrase, okay? And that's why it's labeled PP. Winter in Gotham, right, is a noun phrase. In winter in Gotham is a prepositional phrase. Snow in winter in Gotham is a noun phrase. The snow in winter in Gotham is a noun phrase. Okay, over here, falls slowly is the verb phrase. We connect that noun phrase with that verb phrase and we get this sentence, the snow in winter in Gotham falls slowly. All right. This next sentence that we're going to diagram is the snow in winter falls slowly from the sky. Okay, so we should have an idea. I want you to, as we see the sentence, try to paint a tree structure in your mind. We know that we've got the snow in winter is doing something over here under the NP, and then falls slowly from the sky is doing something over here underneath the VP. Okay, and we know that in this case, we have a little bit more going on underneath the VP this time rather than underneath the NP. Okay. And go ahead and take one moment just to provide category labels for each of these linguistic items. And ready, let's move on to the solution. All right, here we go. Okay, the is a determiner, snow is a noun, in is a preposition, winter is a noun. Okay, falls is a verb, slowly is an adverb, right? From is a preposition, the is a determiner, and sky is a noun. Okay. Now we just need to put these pieces together. In winter is a prepositional phrase. Okay. Snow in winter is the noun phrase. The snow in winter is the noun phrase at this level right here. Okay. Over here, the sky is the noun phrase right here. From the sky is the prepositional phrase. Slowly from the sky is the adverb phrase. Fall slowly from the sky is the verb phrase. Okay. Then we can connect the noun phrase and the verb phrase to build that sentence. Okay. And our rules are all provided right here for us. Okay. So please go ahead and feel free to check each step with the provided rules. All right, we have about 2 more examples left. Okay. And the purpose of the next 2 examples is to appreciate productivity recursive applications underneath the VP this time. Okay. Excuse me. So this sentence is Darkseid knew that Batman survived. For the sake of time, we could have started with a simpler sentence and then built to this one, but we already did such a basic example. I didn't want to waste time going through another basic example like Batman survived, because we already did Catwoman escaped, right? But real quick to point out here that Batman survived is already an S, right? But we can build another larger S, another larger sentence with a sentence embedded within that larger sentence, right? So Darkseid knew that Batman survived, okay? So we see that we have a conjunction using that clauses here, which is really cool, okay? It's another thing that's gonna help us purchase productivity with our cognitive abilities, right? All right, cool. Excuse me. So go ahead and try to identify each of these linguistic items and take a moment you might have to reflect on what's going on with that. Okay, and there's, in the literature, there's going to be some debates like, how do we treat this, right? But for today, we'll treat it as we'll see in the next slide. Okay, ready? Here we go. Okay, so Darkseid is a noun. Knew is a verb. That is a conjunction for that clauses, right? And here I just label this as C for that clause, okay? Batman is a noun and survived is a verb. Okay, so we see that we can start over here, and this would just be a basic sentence, right? Like Batman survived. As you can see, this looks exactly like the structure from our first example, Catwoman escaped. Okay, now what we're doing is we're building a larger structure on top of that. Okay, so we're going to need to use what's called an S bar here. And the S bar is going to be a rule that allows us to use that to connect a sentence, right? And embed that sentence within a larger sentence, okay? So we see that the S bar right here allows us to connect a C with an S, okay? S bar connects C and an S, so S bar connects C and S. Great, okay? The VP, right, the verb phrase can take a verb and an S bar, right? Knew that Batman survived. And we see that that rule is provided right here. VP can take a V and an S bar, okay? And then nothing new right here, right? We know that an S takes an NP and a VP. So in this case, the NP is an N, which is Darkseid, and the VP is knew that Batman survived, okay? And that's how we get this very cool structure. Darkseid knew that Batman survived. Okay. Awesome. We have one more example, and this one is gonna take what we learned, just like how we took the prepositional phrase and then we recursively applied it again, just to get the idea that, we can reiterate this multiple times. I want to show you that with this underneath the VP, that we can similarly, reiterate the application of that clause is underneath the VP, okay? So this one's gonna be a long example, but in principle, we're gonna do very similar things, okay? So this sentence, our final sentence for today, is Barbatos knew that, Darkseid knew that, Batman survived. Okay, how do we draw the tree structure for this? Okay, we know that Barbatos knew something, and there's going to be some complicated structural arrangements going on underneath that VP. Okay, so do your best and try to provide that right now using this list of rules. Okay, remember, first thing you want to do is identify each of these linguistic items, and we know what all these are now, right? We know how to classify that, right? It's a conjunction for that clauses, right? And the rest is our easy work, how to classify those items. So Barbatos is a noun, new is a verb, that is a conjunction for that clauses, Darkseid is a noun, new is a verb, that is a conjunction for that clauses, Batman is a noun, survived is a verb, okay? And I hope you got the feeling of how like we started repeating structurally similar things, right? And that's sort of the insight here, is that via the linguistic principles or rules, there's nothing preventing us from boom, 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 making this even longer and longer and more complicated. And in some sense, with theory of mind, when we think about what other people are thinking about, or we're thinking about what they think we're thinking about, right? Theory of mind, we see that something like this is useful, right? Or helpful for forming thoughts about other people's thoughts. Okay, so we see that language is very important and central to cognition and cognitive science, okay? And that's why we're looking at systematicity and productivity today. Although I think that this is fun and fascinating in its own right, we're using this for the purpose of thinking about cognition and the mind, okay? So I'm not done with this example just yet, okay? I just want to show you that we'll go step by step, right? So we know that a sentence consists of a noun phrase and a verb phrase. We know that an S bar can take a C and an S, right? We know that the VP takes a V and an S bar. And we know that the S takes an NP and a VP. We know that because we just did that from the last example. And what we did here is we just added this, we just embedded that within the larger structure, okay? We took the small structure and embedded it in this larger structure. And now we took this larger structure and embedded it in this even larger structure, okay? And so we just need to embed Darkseid knew that Batman survived, right? Underneath the content of what Barbatos knows, right? This is sort of like the propositional content of Barbatos's thoughts, right? So we know that in S bar, right? Because we see from right here, the S bar was what allowed us to take a C and an S. And since we have an S bar right here, we know that that can take a C and an S, okay? And then from here, we know that the VP can take a V and an S bar. So we use that same rule up here. The VP can take a V and an S bar. And then we know that a sentence can take an NP and a VP. So boom, all our rules. Like we didn't actually have to do anything new in principle, right? Just sort of new in practice. Like we already knew the principles for putting these things together from the last example. We just had to do it in this case with these additional items, okay? So you can go ahead and check your work, and this is now the tree structure for Barbatos knew that, Darkseid knew that, Batman survived. Okay, and that is our last example for today, for how to identify linguistic items in terms of their category labels and how to apply phrase structure rules to those items and build hierarchical tree structure diagrams for our sample sentences. Okay, we sampled 12 different types of sample sentences today just to get a feel for the different types of maneuvers that can be done to augment the complexity of our sentences. So I hope that you found this lecture very interesting and insightful, and that it helps you think more about the systematic and productive nature of language and how the systematic and productive nature of language helps with the systematic and productive nature of our cognitions and thoughts. Okay, thank you so much for your attention today, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow for our next lecture.